over time, what I found was that if I was actually connecting in that way, that people's experience of the work was in alignment with that. And so I encourage anyone that is expressing their art to really go into that place of connection with the divine. What is your intention? What are you looking to express? And then just get out of the way and let it arise.
Absolutely. And certainly. Oh, please, Jason, go ahead. Yeah, why not?
I'm glad I got a chance to listen to these two because now I know what I can talk about. Anxiety was mentioned. Getting out of the way was mentioned. Both of those things for me, I tell stories. And in the work that I do, I don't create on a blank canvas. I'm given, let's say, given materials. I've always thought of Rojcewicz as sort of hero in humanities and painting in the sense of found material. And the other word I wanted to mention is truth. I've found that meditation for me over the years has offered me not only a sense of peace with myself, but a clarity about myself. And that clarity has enabled me, I think, to translate into telling someone's story. And then it becomes a question of, well, is it my interpretation of their story or their story? And partly what Shay just said, if you are connecting with the art that you're creating in an honest way, in a genuine way, then you have to trust that the perceiver, the audience, whatever that might be, will do the same thing. If they don't, they don't. That's beyond your control anyway. But there's this sense of when I, through meditation, was able to see myself in a clear way, without all the anxiety, and accept myself in that way. I was able to turn that around and look at someone else's experience and try and find the truth of their experience. That clarity was transferred into my ability to tell stories. So over the years, as my practice has gotten deeper, and certainly as I've gotten older, hopefully wiser, my work has changed, and it's become more subtle, and it has allowed me to get out of the way. And I think a lot of the anxiety is you being in the way. So when you can let go of that, that seems to be the point at which the story starts telling you what to do. The painting starts telling you what to do. You're no longer trying to manipulate the product. It's talking to you. And then you just go along with the ride.
That's wonderful. I mean, I'm curious also, Peter, specifically from the writing perspective, that's something that I greatly can appreciate, but, when it comes to poetry as well, where you're dealing with language, what your take would be on that?
Well, for me, poetry comes down to listening. And so early on, I realized that there was a connection between listening to the chatter of my mind and listening to every moment of my life. So right away, I realized that poetry or any art form, my own definition would be that art is an act of attention. In my case, an act of listening and being available to sound, to the sound of words, to the rhythm of objects moving across the world, to the sound of joy or panic with human beings, but just to be available to that soundscape. And often a poem will begin with a sound. It will begin sometimes with a word that isn't even discursive, that doesn't really communicate something rational. But there's some meaning or power of commitment, of alliance, of allegiance, in a strange sound of words that together don't make logical sense, but when you follow that sequence forward, there is a message that says, do not limit your understanding of the poem to what your ego is trying to analyze in terms of the words. Feel and interpret in the domain of rhythm, or feel and interpret the message in the domain of sound. And I think Wallace Stevens is the great teacher of mine on how meaning is often cross-referenced through words, through sounds that are non-rational, through backdrop, through lighting, through a whole series of ways. And poetry does the same thing. And so by listening in meditation, I'm able to, I think, be more aware of the richness, the principle of rich texture that is around in urban landscapes, in nature, and be available to that. And try, again, people talking about getting out of the way. You know, I think poetry appears when we disappear, when we allow that sound. Again, and meditators talk about sounds, powerful. You know, what is Om? What's something that moves through the universe, and to be available to that. So poetry for me and meditation are very close. It's an act of attention.
Well, that's particularly illuminating in terms of with Nikolai, because I've been wondering about this personally in terms of the Museum of Silence. Because one would think that when one is silent, that they can hear more. But for anyone who's attempted to be silent on their own, sometimes when you find yourself getting silent, you're hearing a lot more just chatter in your head going on. You know, so it's not as though, oh, I can really hear more of the world and whatnot, but it's just like I'm hearing a bunch of mishigas that I wish would just stop. So for Nikolai having a Museum of Silence, I'm very interested to hear about what that would involve.
Okay, he is a very still person already.
That helps.
As a child. Oh, as a child he went into nature a lot. And at one point he thought he would become an artist. He became a conceptual artist. So he always asked himself, what do I want to tell others? So when he did the paintings, he had loved very much that they would be in silence and stillness. So I make the art, first of all, for myself. And then he would show it in the exhibitions. And it was very obvious to others that his paintings were very silent still, meditative. Oh, then his next thought was that a lot of people have a lot of anxiety, a lot of angst. Yeah, a lot of telephone and a lot of things going on. Making crazy life. So he created the Stillness Museum about 24 years ago. And in the last few years, a lot of younger people have been coming. It's in East Berlin. So they all come in to meditate. He has this one bench in the museum. called the Stillness Museum also because he has architectural designs for future stillness meditation rooms. Yeah, one of them he actually built and put it in the gallery in Soho.
Were you used to be the
Yeah,
curator?
I
Right?
had a gallery in Soho. We actually had it in there. It was huge. It was like 20 feet high, about 20, 30 feet around. And you could walk in. Yeah, he did it with the architect named Michael Marshall out of Washington, D.C. Yeah, and then after the exhibition in Soho, it was actually gifted to the Arno Museum, upstate New York, Museum of Spiritual Art. It's a Museum of Spiritual Art. So now he has 6 different models. So he wants to, in the future, have these 6 become real life and put them all over the world. Yeah, because it's necessary now for people to meditate much more. Yeah, oh, just like how before 20 years ago, no one was thinking about being vegan. Now it's being vegan. So stillness is very good for your health.
Amen. Well, and that's very interesting in terms of this aspect of how, saying that meditation seems to be something that's even more needed now. Obviously, it's been around for centuries, and it brings up, it kind of illuminates this certain point about the process or the technique, which is how we relate to distraction. As you brought up, Peter, in terms of a poet, anyone that is working with language, hearing sound, interpreting sound, and how you choose to relate to that. So certainly when it comes to any kind of image that would kind of pass through the mind, or color that would pass through the mind, so, or as it would relate to specifically a musical sound, maybe not a linguistic sound, and so forth, I think it can be worthwhile for us to kind of talk about that way of relating to what before used to be a distraction. I'm distracted by this sound or this image. But through certain types of meditative techniques, you can use that. You can actually use that in your process to inform whatever it is that you're creating. So someone wants to speak to that, using distraction in a constructive way.
I'm incredibly distracted, so I'll start.
Perfect.
In my artwork, it's so important for me to center in intention. I'm sure that is something for these artists as well, maybe many of you as artists. Because the chatter of the mind is so wild. What do we call it, a monkey mind, or like a wild pony in that way. And I'll use a specific example of the paintings that I do, the ones that are on exhibit here, are done, I use a contemporary painting style of pointillism. And so what that allows me to do is I layer in many different layers of color within each field. And as I am sitting in front of a big canvas with this idea of all these little dots that need to be put in place, I allow myself to sink into this meditative place, and I invite myself to use the busyness of my mind to visualize a particular result. And it's not the result of the painting, it's more the result of my intentions. So each dot, as it's placed individually on the canvas, is visualized as this jeweled universe. It's of rubies and emeralds and sapphires and suns and moons and stars, and they're made as offerings with a request for blessings to come to the world to end suffering. So the busyness that is naturally inherent in my mind is employed for a different kind of purposefulness. And I have found over the years that that settles me into this very quiet place, this place of a possibility for a peaceful world, for a true end of suffering for all beings. And it holds my imagination, it holds my attention, because that's just something that would be so amazing. So that's one of the techniques that I would use, and one of the ways that I have found my discursive mind can be employed to maybe generate something that might be of a bit more benefit than some of the other chatter.
Jason?
Yeah. I'm really easily distracted, as my wife always says. And she hates watching television with me. I was just thinking about when you were speaking about how I do with that. Because I work in the proverbial cave, that the dark room that villagers always are assumed to work in. It's actually true. When the way that I handle it is, if I'm watching, then I often will turn off sound. And so I will enforce a silence. And I am watching. I came out of a dance background. I was a dancer before I got into filmmaking. And so I came into my career speaking body language and reading body language. And so when I turn off sound, I'm able to watch just how people are reacting physically in space or to one another, and the slightest tilt of a head, or the blink of an eye, or the dropping of a shoulder can say volumes. And so one way that I do that is by turning off the sound, taking everything out of its original context, and recreating that in the world that I am, the picture that I'm painting at the time. I do the reverse when it comes to sound. I will often close my eyes and just listen, because I don't want to be distracted by what's actually going on. I want to hear the intent of the words, the rhythm of the speech, and see how I can use that in a melodic way, in a way of creating the narrative of the story that I'm telling. So the way that I deal with it is I sort of enforce a silence, both an auditory one or a visual one.
Go ahead.
I'm just in shamatha all the time, so I don't know what you guys are talking about. It's not true at all. What came to mind for me was making music, and sort of how it works the other way around. That in the studio with electronic music, especially more left field electronic music, there's an attunement that you get to the fine details of noise and sound. And the way that music is made in the electronic world these days is with a computer and with plugins that can emulate every amp that's ever been made. Every guitar amp that's ever been made, you have access to those, all these different tonal colors and palettes that you can work with. And in the electronic world, we tend to take those plugins and then do extreme things with them to find new sound, new ways of expressing music and rhythm and harmonics and melody. And looking for different kinds of distortions. What does it do to that strange little bit of percussion in the background if I just compress it, crush the signal, and then I put a certain type of distortion on it and look for these little artifacts of sound, and it creates a very detailed and nuanced sense in the mind around sound. And I noticed when meditating with my current meditation teacher, with Pastor Chuladasa, that in building up this strength of awareness, the method that he teaches is very much built around this attention and awareness, these two modalities of perception, and how to build those appropriately. And I noticed that sound, being in my peripheral awareness, I was very much attuned to that from just being in the studio between the speakers for hours and hours, just geeking out on these different kinds of sounds. I was looking forward to make a dance floor track that was going to end up being, you know, pushed for a sound system in a very loud environment, but actually work equally in the inner environment. That I could pick up these small sounds, like the background of the workings of a clock, even if it wasn't ticking loudly, and those kind of elements that I would hear in a sonic environment, these textures that would catch some aspect of the mind, would help energize the mind. I could use those because they had so much meaning to me. I could use those to energize my mind and to keep the sense of alert and alive mind while I was meditating. So that was one of the unexpected benefits that I had from doing music, and then being able to flip some of those skills that I developed in music into my meditation practice, which then of course feeds back the other way as well and out into life. So that was a beautiful discovery for me.
Well, I can see why. I mean, you know, in kind of each of these instances, whether it was, you know, in the film editing cave or in front of the canvas or, you know, in front of the mix board, it seems as though, you know, in each of those experiences is taking whatever is arising, and now however you're relating to it, it can be something that is a distraction, or it can be discursive, or it can be completely nourishing, completely cultivating whatever it is that you want to create. And at least for me personally, what that underscores is this Buddhist concept of emptiness. That it can only be something that is a distraction or is contributing or beneficial because it isn't inherently one way or the other. Right. So, you know, I think maybe that's something we can start to delve into is if you agree that that is something that is at work, you know, that the words don't have any nature of their own, that the sounds, the colors, the shapes don't. It's how you're relating to, how that ends up really being able to inform and cultivate what you do with your art. The fact that something isn't what it is in terms of just from your perception of it. You know, it's how you relate to it. So, Peter, would you like to jump in on that? That's okay.
Well, let me start where often there are times when my mind is just untamable, and during those times, I simply try to sit in awareness, to listen to the chatter, to follow it through. I try to be kind to my mind. I try not to dominate it, which is something I can, you know, often do. Take myself on as a challenge. So being kind to my mind is more like being the parents. Not that I am, but I've watched parents who allow their children to wander off in a restaurant a little bit, and they slowly let them go to a certain perimeter, and then they kind of kindly bring them back. And so during those moments of meditation where the silence isn't there, I simply try to listen and follow through where the mind is going. And that opened up something, and I realized that was calming. That had a certain powerful effect on me. And then when I went to writing and listening to the soundscapes, as a young person I thought I could only write a poem in nature. You know, the pastoral context would lead to insights and metanoias and visions and Blakean moments. But I realized from the meditation that if I would simply follow the sounds wherever I was, I often would censor them. Those were unpoetic sounds. those words were not aesthetically pleasing. I would be dominating it, unlike in the meditation moment when I would simply watch where it went, listen to the sound, the chatter of the mind. And then when I realized that if I could just be present to the sounds in an urban landscape, I recognized pauses. I recognized stopped quiet, which then I was allowed by the poem to make line breaks that allowed for silence, that allowed for pause of non-activity, which made the poems more dynamic. And so I think it was a relationship between Vipassana meditation, which I think personally is inherently appreciative and artful, and it often is highly psychological, at least for me, in the sense that if I'm in a walking meditation, it allows for me to receive new information, and that meditative state allows me to manage existing material that's already in my experiential banks. So if that makes any sense, I think now by being present to all sounds, the poems are stronger. I was once at a poetry reading with my mentor, and a young person that was a classmate of mine, he was a freshman in college, said, well, you can't write poems about gasworks. There's nothing poetic here. I stood up because I agreed. There's nothing poetic in gasworks. And so he challenged the poet to get gasworks into a poem. And the poet's name was David Ignato. He lived in New York for a while and then in Hamptons. A year later, I opened up a journal. And there, in the opening line of a David Ignato poem was, get the gasworks in a poem, and you've got cacophony and grunge and all that. And the poem began. And I said, it hit me like a harpoon. And so there's something, again, about just being attentive to the mind when the silence is not there that helped me actually in my poetry recognize that all words, not to interfere with the moment, not to add to it, not try to dominate it, but everything was there that I needed.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way of really highlighting that kind of, that way of relating to, as you were saying, whether it's the sound and then if the word itself that arises, as to, because it isn't necessarily one thing or another, gasworks isn't necessarily this or that, but how you choose to relate to it, because it isn't inherently anything or any particular notion or idea, it almost kind of illuminates, the emptiness of the sound or the thought or language as permission. It's as though you have permission now. You have this availability and this potential to make of this whatever that you want to, and that really, that's a beautiful way of putting it, just even with that one word.
If I may just follow through, what it meant for me was to recognize that, to use words like emptiness, which scares most people. We get a little sad to think that things are not lastingly real or permanently real. Everything is transient. Everything is a provisional form or sound or color or light. What it did for me is to recognize that because of that, everything was workable. that if, to use your term, if everything is is dependent co-arising, then I was co-creating. That I was part of that there is a natural interdependence there that itself was, I think, potentially creative.
Absolutely. Were you going to say something?
Me?
Yeah.
Not really, but I can.
I saw you nodding earlier.
Well, I was agreeing with everything that's been said. I was thinking about emptiness, and I was thinking about it when I began to understand emptiness. It freed me. Otherwise, I would have been stuck in this neurotic, angry self who I used to be, and I certainly didn't want to be there. I was also thinking of I had the honor of working with a master filmmaker named Robert Altman, who gave me very few directions, but one of them was on this film, and I took it as a mantra for my life and my work. This story takes place out of the corner of your eye. And it took me a long time to really just begin to grasp what that meant. But I think it relates back to silence. I think it relates back to between the words, to between the strokes, between the points, between the notes. It's life that's just flitting by that you just barely notice. What was that? What was that? It's not what's right in front of you. It's what's implied. What's and this goes back to this idea of attention, which is really another way of expressing emptiness. So I think that's what you were referring to.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Thank you for that. It reminded me of one of the things that attracted me to the pointillism. It's a contemporary technique. I wondered if my traditional teachers would have an issue with it, but they loved it, and I think they loved it for some of the reasons that I came to love it, and one of them was that they're all little dots, they're all distinct moments that are nothing really in themselves, yet is the image that arises, is it there between the dots, or is it in the dot, or what is happening in that experience? So one isn't even trying to create something solid and real. One is just in that particular moment with that particular intention and watching the unfolding of that happen. And I just think it's a beautiful metaphor for our lives and the choices that we make from moment to moment, and just allowing them to be and knowing that life may actually be arising from those spaces in between.
Yeah, and that really, that beautifully illustrates how meditation really, with this conceptualization of emptiness or interdependence, really can cultivate compassion. It's just like you were saying, Peter, in terms of for you, it's like, oh, now all of this is workable. This is actually, I can actually relate to this in a meaningful, purposeful, constructive way. So it actually then releases you from the fear. And it isn't necessarily that one needs to be doing what would be quote unquote, a heart-based compassion meditation, but this fundamental way is simply how you're relating to what's arising, and if that's something that maybe we could kind of investigate that a little bit more as to how you feel in your own lives just through your artistry and that process of creating artwork has been naturally creating, let's say naturally creating this sense of compassion for you, because I know for me personally it's something where in that gap, as you were saying, the space in between the next sound, the silence and so forth, that actual moment of relating, that absence, is what gives the space for a desire to connect, which to me is fundamentally what compassion is really rooted in, is this connection with whomever or whatever, is happening. So, if anybody else can also speak to that as well, how that compassion really arises in this way of relating to reality in that way. Yeah.
Here's an interesting question. What is the amount of time needed for meditation? Sometimes he meditates 2 hours a day. then he doesn't want to paint anymore because he's too happy.
Please hold the mic a little closer so we can.
Okay. Oh, his big problem is he lives in Germany, and the Germans are very active, very busy. Yeah. And they always say the Russians are very lazy.
Would the Germans say that?
Not the Russians.
Well, certainly, I mean, you know, this actually is related to compassion on many levels. But first and foremost,
in his Museum of Silence, he says that many times he feels it's like McDonald's meditation because people come in there and just stay for 15 minutes and then leave.
That's a great way of putting it. Just the fast food just fast service, quick service of meditation. Well, everybody, of course, on the panel, can speak to that. Go ahead.
On the question of compassion, how does poetry facilitate or enhance or relate to it? If I think about arts in two ways, not only as the formal discipline we practice, whether it's painting, visual arts, performing arts, graphic arts, that's certainly one form of it. But the other form of art, which will get me to compassion, I believe, has to do with the artistry of living everyday life. In that respect, there is a kind of message that we send that says, as far as compassion goes, it's not simply a matter of what we do. We make films, we tell stories, we write poems, we paint on canvas. While that's important, it's also a matter of how we do it, but it's also more important, perhaps, of who we become as a result of what we do and how we do it. And I think that's where compassion comes in. So, it's not enough. Once I heard two surgeons speaking at a conference in Manhattan, and they were competitive about their success surgeries. I've done 45 open heart surgeries. I've done this and that. But from a point of view of compassion, it seems to me it's not so much how much success you have as a surgeon, but whether or not we can demonstrate that we have been made better by the practice of the art of medicine. And so I think that way, when we think of who we become by being a filmmaker, or who I become as a result of poetry, and being open to the moment, and every moment, every person comes in could be the difference in my life because of this interdependence. I think that's where compassion comes in. And the trick is not to look at people, I'm speaking to myself, as a means to a poetic end. That's not what I'm saying, right? That would be unethical. That's using people to get what I need, right? It's a source of poetry. Go ahead, Gavin, say something interesting so I can write it down, right? It's not what I mean.
And that's, I completely also relate that to, even with Nikolai's question about, how long for meditation, because that to me speaks to that it isn't, in the case of the surgeon, something that's quantitative, it's totally qualitative. What is the quality of how you are relating, to this moment, whatever's being offered, and so forth, that the quality of that attention that you're placing on the poem, on the canvas, on the music, on the film, is what it fundamentally can come down to, to be both compassionate to your own mind, but of course, whoever it is, and whatever it is that you're relating to. So, at least for me personally, in that sense, I know when I started out in meditation practice, I did have a very strong sense of it being quantitative. You know, I'm going to sit, you know, for X amount of time. That's obviously what I needed. That was something about building a discipline for me and so forth. So I think that very much can be of service. And just where I'm at now, you know, in my experience with it, it's something that is far more focused on the qualitative aspect of it. So I don't even think in terms of time about it at all. And that is the element to me that also goes right back to compassion about that, because that's underscoring then what the motivation is, which is it's about how, you know, the how.
No, please, you have to say.
It just raises a pretty wild question in my mind then. If ultimately art, at least in the way that we're talking about it now, leads to compassion, then if we were compassionate on a regular basis as part of the art of everyday living and the art of relating as we choreograph our relationships, husband to wife and parents to children, and if we score our conversations to be melodic and dignified and respectful and loving and compassionate to each other, and if we compose our activities as if it were a poem, and compassion therefore lives, would art then become obsolete and not necessary?
It's a really good point. And I think that along the line of what you were saying, Brian, about you know, why do we meditate? What is the whole point of that? Yeah, so we can have a quiet mind, or we can be kind of cool and hip and up to date. You know, but we're really meditating so that we can go beyond, you know, those things. And is the work that we're doing, how does it relate to our practice and our purposefulness in life? I feel like as an artist, for me, art is my voice, and I have to ask myself, what is it that I'm wanting to say to the world? And then in the act of actually, I've made a choice, and I'm choosing images that I hope will inspire and turn our minds towards thoughts of compassion. But then in that action, is that something that's supporting me as a practitioner, stepping through into a deeper understanding? And again, I go back to, I kind of love my little dots because they take me into the moment every time. And the real point, just like meditation, the value is, the time on the cushion is lovely, but where it really matters is when we step out into our lives and how that impacts the moment by moment choices that we make. And so for me, the practice of the dots and the envisioning and the giving rise to some level of bodhicitta, it reminds me and it trains me towards that practice in my day-to-day life. So I think it's a brilliant question. How does our work, you know, support us in in our commitment towards this awakening consciousness, whether it's our own or whether we're really thinking in terms of the broader contribution that we're making with each choice. So, and each of us can do that with our work. We can think about that and how it interfaces with the world and how it interfaces with our commitment to compassion.
Well, and to your question there, Peter, about, you know, art becoming obsolete, if all of those aspects that you were highlighting were to be actualized, yes, that would be wonderful to me within this framework, which would be, if one is defining art on the basic level as a conceptualization from a human mind, or art as an orientation, as a way of relating, you know, to the world or to reality, that for a human being who has been able to fully awaken their consciousness, however you would define that experience, you know, I kind of defer to Nagarjuna, who's a great Buddhist scholar, who would say, you know, that state of being would be, there would no longer be any viewpoints. You know, there are no more. You know, you're not, this being of consciousness is no longer relating to reality. in that way. So therefore, any kind of conceptualization would be obsolete. That's getting kind of highbrow about it, to say the least. But in a very fundamental way, I think it's something that, you know, it's maybe putting it in much more simple terms. There's always kind of the story about the Dharma in the sense of, you know, whatever teachings are helping you to become a more compassionate and wise human being. If you were to say that those teachings, you know, are a raft, and many will know this story, it's like you come to the river, and that river is kind of all of the suffering that you experience and so forth, and then here you're able to construct this raft, you know, of the teachings with a teacher that's going to help you actually to be able to relate to all of this in a much more healthy way. So you get on it, and you're able to cross over your river of suffering, and then you get over the other side, and it's like, all right, we no longer need the raft, you know. So there's that kind of sense of it becoming obsolete?
Well, I think so. I mean, what we're talking about now is very much an attack on the time-honored tradition of art for art's sake, it seems to me. Because if art is for its own sake, then questions of whether it leads to compassion, whether it recognizes a gap, you know, is art the stop gap? You know, is it the vehicle that gets us to compassion, and once we're there, we kick the raft away? So the question again for a meditator or meditative art, you know, which is an act of, you know, attention. I think there's always art for a purpose, I think ethical, moral purpose in this case, to realize compassion, to recognize each moment as for what it is and not try to change it and recognize it in its light and dark aspects. And ultimately, whether our art is compensatory to dominant attitudes, maybe racist and sexist and misogynist and misanthropic and whatever, it's still a gap we're trying to fill. We're trying to bring to the national and collective awareness a voice that is not heard, an energy that is not lived, an alliance that's not respected, a friendship that is ignored. But if those were to be restored in wholeness, wherein compassion perhaps is at the core, then art maybe would be unnecessary. We would be living artfully.
Absolutely, and that's, you know, that's a beautiful place for actually to us come to a conclusion with this, because, and to note, I would say probably about this is one of my very wise teachers said to me about the whole deal with the raft. You know, when you get to the other side and you put the raft down, and she said to me, until the next time you need to pick the raft up. So, in terms of, you know, everybody's own personal meditative practice and compassion and how you're living your life and relating to others in the world, you know, maybe that can be something of value to you as well. But I want to take a moment to just, you know, express my gratitude to everybody on this panel. Number one, for, of course, your practice and what you're doing in the world, and also to the amazing presenters and organizers of this festival for giving us this opportunity to share this with one another. So please continue to enjoy the amazing offerings that are happening during this festival for the rest of the week up until Thursday, because there's wonderful art, literally, from two of the artists here on the panel that's in the exhibition hall, and many other great artists as well. So thank you again to everyone. Thank you.